Sometimes the words that arrive in silence can shake us the most. That evening, when my grandson spoke with a softness I almost missed, I realized he was telling me more than just words. He was opening a door I never expected. Before I begin, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that has stayed with me for years. The house was unusually quiet that evening. Outside, the sun had nearly slipped beyond the hills, leaving streaks of orange and purple across the horizon. I had made tea, the way I always do when my grandson visits. He's not a boy anymore, taller now, his voice deeper, his shoulders broader, but to me, he will always carry a piece of the child I once cradled in my arms. He sat across from me at the wooden kitchen table, his hands wrapped around the mug, though he hadn't taken a sip. I noticed the way he kept looking down, his eyes fixed on the steam rising between us. Something in his quietness told me he wasn't just here for tea. There was weight in the air, the kind that doesn't come from words but from the pauses before them. I wanted to reach out, to ask what was on his mind, but I held back. Sometimes silence is its own language. He shifted in his chair, and the light from the lamp caught his profile. For the first time, I saw traces of the man he was becoming. Strong, thoughtful, but with an uncertainty that reminded me of myself at his age. His quietness wasn't avoidance, it was preparation. He was gathering the courage to let something out, and I knew that if I spoke too soon, I might break the moment. The clock ticked loudly on the wall, each second stretching into the next. Finally, his voice came, so soft that at first I wasn't sure I had heard him. "Grandma," he began, and the way he said it, low, deliberate, made me set down my cup. "There's something I need to tell you, but I don't know if you'll understand." My heart stirred. It wasn't fear, but something deeper, a recognition that this was one of those moments life gifts us only rarely, the kind where you're called to listen with more than your ears. I leaned forward, letting my hand rest gently near his on the table. "You don't have to be afraid of what I'll think," I told him softly. "Just speak your heart." He looked up at me then, his eyes searching mine. Behind the hesitance, I saw a storm of emotions: worry, hope, longing to be understood. It reminded me of the first time I had confided in my own grandmother. Back then, I had been terrified, but her patience and warmth gave me courage. Now the circle had turned, and it was my turn to be that anchor. As he began to speak, I could see how carefully he chose his words. His voice trembled, but each sentence carried the weight of something he had carried too long in silence. He wasn't just sharing a story. He was handing me a piece of himself. And as he spoke, I realized the room had changed. The walls, the ticking clock, the dim light, all of it faded into the background. What remained was the bond between us, stretched across generations, tested by time, but alive in that very moment. I listened, really listened, the way one does when the world pauses. I nodded, let him see that I was here, that nothing he could say would push me away. And though the details of his words are his to share, not mine to repeat, I will tell you this. It wasn't the confession itself that shook me. It was the trust he placed in me to hold it. When he finished, he looked almost surprised at himself, like he couldn't believe the words had finally left his lips. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't heavy. It was full, like the quiet after a song that stays echoing in your chest. I reached across the table and touched his hand, not with answers, not with advice, but with a steady presence that said, "I hear you. I see you. You are not alone." That evening changed something in me too. His quiet words reminded me of the power of being still, of letting someone unfold at their own pace. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give is not our wisdom, but our willingness to listen, to sit in the silence until it speaks. And in that moment, I felt grateful, not just for his trust, but for the chance to grow closer in a way I hadn't expected. The morning after his quiet words, I found myself staring out the kitchen window longer than usual, watching the garden sway in the gentle wind. I had brewed another pot of tea, but I hardly touched it. His voice still lingered in my mind, not loud, but steady, like a stream finding its way through stones. What he shared the night before wasn't something I could easily put away. It had settled into me, stirring thoughts about love, family, and the unspoken things we often hide from one another. When he walked into the kitchen that day, I noticed something different in him. His shoulders didn't seem as heavy, and his eyes carried a kind of relief, as if speaking out had freed him just a little. He gave me a small smile, the kind that spoke more than words, and I couldn't help but return it. It reminded me of when he was a little boy, and he'd come running to me after scraping his knee, his tears drying only when I held him close. Except now, it wasn't scraped skin I was tending to, it was his heart. I wanted to ask questions, to know more, but I also knew better. Sometimes when someone has been brave enough to share, what they need most isn't another wave of questions, but a safe harbor where their truth can rest. So instead, I made his favorite breakfast, just like I used to when he stayed over during school vacations. Pancakes, crisp around the edges, with blueberries folded in and a drizzle of honey. As I placed the plate in front of him, he looked at me with a quiet gratitude, and I could see that simple gestures still mattered. We sat together, not saying much at first. The sound of forks against plates filled the room, and outside, the birds were busy with their own conversations. It was an ordinary morning in every way, but beneath the surface, something had shifted. I wasn't just a grandmother sharing breakfast with her grandson. I was holding a bridge between who he had been and who he was becoming. After a while, he put down his fork and looked at me, his expression careful. "Grandma," he said softly, "do you ever feel like people don't really see you? Like they think they know who you are, but it's not the whole truth?" His words touched something deep inside me. I thought back to when I was younger, raising his mother, trying to balance work, family, and the quiet dreams I never spoke of. There were years when I felt invisible, like my sacrifices were part of the wallpaper no one noticed. I nodded slowly, choosing my words with care. "Yes," I said. "I think everyone feels that way at some point. But it doesn't mean your truth doesn't matter. Sometimes it just takes time for others to be ready to see it." He looked down, fiddling with the edge of his napkin, and I could tell my words had landed somewhere inside him. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was thoughtful, like we were both sifting through memories of being unseen. I reached across the table again, placing my hand over his. "You don't have to hide who you are with me," I told him. "I may not always have the answers, but I'll always have room to listen." His eyes softened, and for the first time, he spoke more openly. He told me about the pressures he felt from friends, from school, from the expectations of others. How he sometimes wore a mask just to keep the peace, but it left him feeling hollow. I could hear the ache in his voice, the need to be understood, and it broke my heart to think he carried this alone for so long. As he talked, I found myself remembering my own youth, the way I had carried silent struggles. The world was different back then, but the feelings were the same. The longing for acceptance, the fear of being judged. I realized in that moment how much history repeats itself, how each generation walks the same paths in different shoes. When he finally paused, I said, "You're stronger than you think. The fact that you can speak these words, even with fear, shows courage. Don't underestimate that." He gave me a look that I'll never forget. Half relief, half wonder. It was as though he hadn't expected to find understanding here, yet he had. That look alone told me that something in our bond had grown deeper. Later that afternoon, we took a walk in the garden. The roses were in bloom, and the air smelled sweet with spring. He walked beside me, not ahead as he used to when he was younger, but right next to me, matching my steps. There was something symbolic in that. He wasn't rushing forward or leaving me behind. We were walking together, side by side, two different generations sharing one quiet path. As we reached the old oak tree at the edge of the yard, he stopped and leaned against the trunk, his hands in his pockets. "I don't know what the future holds," he admitted, "but I know I don't want to pretend anymore. I want to live honestly, even if it's hard." I looked at him, my heart swelling with pride. "That's all anyone can ask of themselves," I replied. "To live with truth. And if ever the world feels too heavy, you know where to find me." He smiled then, a real smile, unguarded, full of light. And in that moment, I knew his quiet words from the night before had not just changed him. They had changed me too. They reminded me that no matter how old we get, life always invites us to keep listening, keep growing, and keep loving without condition. The days that followed seemed to carry a different rhythm. There was no sudden transformation, no dramatic shift, but rather a quiet ease that lingered in the air between us. My grandson began to visit more often, sometimes staying late into the evening. He didn't always speak of the heavy things. Sometimes we just talked about ordinary matters, the weather, his favorite music, or the new book I had been reading. Yet, even in those small exchanges, I sensed something new. He was allowing himself to be more open, and I was learning how to listen with a softer heart. One evening after dinner, he offered to help me with the dishes. It was something he rarely did before, always too restless to stand still at the sink. But this time, he rolled up his sleeves, and we worked side by side, the sound of running water and clinking plates filling the kitchen. At first, we spoke of nothing in particular. Then, in the middle of drying a plate, he said quietly, "I told you because I knew you wouldn't look at me differently. That means more than I can explain." His words pierced me, not with sadness, but with a tender kind of ache. I turned to him and said, "Love doesn't change when the truth comes out. If anything, it grows stronger. That's what family is for." I saw his shoulders relax, as though he had been carrying that fear even after his confession. That night, after he left, I sat in my chair by the window and thought about how fragile trust is. It can take years to build, but only a moment to shatter. I realized my role wasn't to fix his struggles or erase his fears. It was simply to keep that trust safe, to guard it as carefully as I would guard a flame in the wind. A few days later, we took a drive into town together. It was something we hadn't done in years, not since he was a boy, and we'd stop for ice cream at the small shop near the park. Now, as we drove, I noticed how he rested his arm out the window, the breeze tugging at his sleeve, a quiet confidence growing in him. He pointed out things along the way, an old store he remembered, the field where he once played soccer, and I found myself smiling at the way his memories were woven into mine. When we reached the park, we walked slowly, the evening sun casting long shadows on the path. Children were playing, parents sat on benches, and the world carried on in its usual hum. Yet for us, the walk held something more. Halfway down the path, he stopped, looking toward the playground. "I used to come here when I felt upset," he said. "I never told anyone, but sitting on the swings made me feel lighter, like I could let things go for a while." I looked at him, struck by the vulnerability of his admission. It wasn't a grand revelation, but it carried the same weight as the words he had shared before. It was a piece of his inner world, handed to me with trust. I gently replied, "Sometimes it's the simplest things that help us heal. And maybe the fact that you're saying it out loud now means you've grown stronger than you think." He nodded, his gaze still on the swings, and I could see the boy he once was layered beneath the young man standing beside me. It made me realize that while he was growing into his own, part of him would always be that child seeking comfort, and part of me would always be the grandmother offering it. That evening, as we sat on a bench together, he grew thoughtful again. "Grandma," he said, "do you think it's possible to really be yourself in this world and still be accepted?" His question hung in the air, as wide and uncertain as the sky above us. I let the silence settle before answering. "Yes," I said. "But it doesn't always happen quickly. Acceptance often takes time, and sometimes it begins with accepting yourself first. Once you do that, others will follow, or if they don't, their loss won't weigh on you the same way." He considered my words carefully, as though measuring them against the doubts he still carried. Then, with a small sigh, he leaned back on the bench, and I could see the question still lived in him. But the burden was a little lighter now. The car ride home was quiet, but it wasn't the uneasy silence of before. It was a companionable kind, like two travelers walking a road together, knowing the other is there even without speaking. That night, when I closed the door after him, I realized something important. His words were not only reshaping him, they were reshaping me too. They reminded me that even at my age, there are still lessons to be learned about patience, love, and the courage it takes to reveal one's true self. And as I sat alone in the quiet of my home, I whispered a prayer of gratitude for the honesty he had shared, for the bond between us, and for the chance to walk this path together, step by step, word by word. The weeks turned into months, and though life carried on in its familiar routines, something between my grandson and me had deepened in ways I couldn't have predicted. His visits became less about habit and more about connection. He didn't come just to eat dinner or pass the time. He came to share pieces of himself, and in turn, I found myself sharing more of me than I ever had before. One Sunday afternoon, he sat with me in the living room while the clock ticked steadily above the mantel. He was quieter than usual, not in a burdened way, but in a reflective one. I asked if something was on his mind, and he gave me a look that reminded me of our first conversation, the night when silence had carried more than words. But this time, he didn't hesitate as much. "I feel like I'm finally learning how to breathe," he said. "It's not perfect, but I don't feel as trapped as I used to." Hearing that filled me with a joy I can't quite describe. It wasn't about solving his struggles or offering advice. It was about seeing him find space to stand taller in his truth. His quiet words from that first night had grown into something larger, rippling through his life and mine in ways neither of us could have expected. We spent that afternoon talking about the future. He told me about his dreams, about paths he was considering, and the uncertainty that came with them. I listened carefully, offering thoughts when he asked, but mostly letting him lead the way. It struck me how different this was from years ago, when I guided him as a child. Now, I wasn't guiding so much as walking beside him, letting him know he didn't have to face the road alone. Later, as the sun began to dip, we stepped out onto the porch. The sky was brushed with the colors of dusk, soft pinks and golds blending into deepening blue. He leaned on the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Do you ever think about how much we don't say to the people we love until it's almost too late?" he asked. His question pierced me, because it was one I had asked myself many times. I thought of my own parents, my grandmother, the people whose words I still longed to hear, even after they were gone. I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said. "But maybe what matters most is that when we do find the courage to speak, we make it count. And you did." He turned to me then, and his eyes carried something I'll never forget: gratitude, trust, and a kind of maturity that comes only when a person begins to accept who they are. "Thank you," he said simply, "for hearing me, for not turning away." I reached for his hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "You gave me a gift too," I told him. "You reminded me that listening is more powerful than advice, and that love grows strongest in silence that's met with understanding." That evening, after he left, I sat on the porch a little longer. The crickets had begun their chorus, and the air was cool against my skin. I thought about how easily I could have missed it all. If I had rushed him that first night, if I had filled the silence with my own words instead of waiting for his. But I hadn't. I had listened, and in doing so, I had been changed too. The truth is, life offers us only a handful of moments that truly alter the way we see the people we love. For me, it was the night my grandson's quiet words revealed more than silence. He trusted me enough to share, and I trusted the silence enough to let it unfold. That trust, simple yet profound, became the bridge between his world and mine. And so, the lesson I carry with me now is this: sometimes the most important words we ever hear are spoken softly, in a moment that feels small, but turns out to be everything. We only have to listen.